Well, it's time for another lecture here in Michigan history. Today, the topic will be the first Michiganians, or Native Americans. There are a few themes I'd like to address in this presentation. First of all, I'd like to talk about the origin of Native Americans in North America. Just as many Europeans migrated to North America, most historians and anthropologists argue that Native Americans migrated here as well. Hollywood would have us believe that all American Indians spoke the same language, had the same characteristics, lived in the same types of homes. That's incorrect. What I want to stress when we address Native Americans living in Michigan is the tremendous diversity throughout all of Indian country. What we'll see is tremendous differences among Native Americans in their economy, their living conditions, and many different customs. So let's explore origins first. There are numerous theories and beliefs as to the origins of Native Americans in North America. I don't mean to step on anyone's personal beliefs, but there's a general consensus among anthropologists and historians. They would argue that human beings first lived in North America somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 years ago. They migrated here, going over a Bering land bridge. Over time, the Earth has experienced cooling trends and warming trends. Going back 30 to 35,000 years ago, during one of those cooling trends, the polar ice caps captured a great deal of ocean water. The levels of water actually dropped dramatically. In the area around the Bering land bridge, which is in the upper left-hand corner of the map shown here where the arrow is, the sea levels dropped so much that Siberia was actually connected to Alaska. Anthropologists theorize that people walked across that so-called land bridge and ended up moving from Siberia to North America and to different parts of Central and South America. This map identifies different cultural groups identified by anthropologists from the time period at or about European contact, approximately 1500. The different colored areas identify common traits among Native Americans living in these regions. Regions like the Great Plains or Eastern Woodlands, Pacific Northwest Coast. Michigan's residents were included in what's now called the Eastern Woodlands. Here's a close-up of the Great Lakes. Essentially, it's not as if Native Americans just lived in what the boundaries of Michigan include today. Native Americans were from all over the Great Lakes, in the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, even New York, and then they also spent time in Michigan. Many lived in what's now Canada. Fossil records and carbon dating show that Native Americans probably began living in the Great Lakes somewhere around 9,000 to 10,000 BC, and they lived there on a permanent basis. One interesting fact is that people living in what's now the Keweenaw Peninsula were the first to create metal tools using copper. I don't know how much time you've spent in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but the arrow here is pointing to the Keweenaw Peninsula. At a northern portion of it, it's also referred to as Copper Harbor because of the natural copper deposits that were located there. Often students are interested in local Native American villages, and there were probably about 19 villages at or about the time of European contact. The red arrows here show the location of several different villages in Mason and Manistee counties. Often they were along rivers like the Pere Marquette, the Lincoln River, the Little Manistee, or the Manistee River. The purple area here shows a large Indian reservation located in Manistee County. Now that we've explored origins, I'd like to address some specific Indian nations. The first will be the Wyandots, also referred to as the Huron. By the 1600s, the largest Indian nation was the Huron. They were located primarily in southeastern Michigan, and you can see the arrow pointing to the Huron on the map here. Now, the people of this Indian nation could be a little bit confusing because they called themselves one name, the Wyandots. The reason for this is because the word Wendat was the Huron term for dwellers on a peninsula. The arrow here shows to their traditional location. They originally lived in what's now Ontario on the peninsula shown here. Well, the French called them the Huron. The reason for this is that the word Huret is French for wild boar. The French gave them this name because the traditional Huron hairstyle reminded them of the head of a wild boar. I will use the words Huron and Wyandot interchangeably. By the mid-1600s, the Wyandot were the largest group in what is now Michigan. They numbered somewhere between 45 to 60,000, and many of them lived in Michigan, but in also some surrounding areas. Politically, the Wyandot were not an Indian tribe. Instead, this was a confederation of 4 Indian tribes. It's better known as an Indian nation. Essentially, what would happen is that representatives of the 4 tribes would periodically meet, they would get together, and they would make political decisions based upon consensus. So the Wyandot originally were located in what's now Canada on that peninsula. Well, as a result of conflict with other Native Americans, particularly the Iroquois, their tremendous enemies, this forced the Huron, or Wyandot, to move to different areas. The arrow here is pointing to the Iroquois. Once Europeans began settling in different colonies in New York, Pennsylvania, and areas like that, they began to push Native Americans westward. Well, the Iroquois came into conflict with Europeans, and therefore they began to push them, they moved themselves westward, which put them in contact with other Indian nations like the Huron. That's the foundation of the conflict between the Iroquois and Huron. And it led to more Huron moving into what is now Michigan. The Huron, or Wyandot, often would live in the same village for many years, 20 years, maybe even 30 years. They did not live in teepees like Hollywood would have us believe. Instead, they lived in longhouses, and their villages were heavily fortified. Here we see a replica of one of these longhouses. They might be as long as 150 to 200 feet in length, and 20 or maybe 25 feet wide. Here we see another photo of a recreated longhouse. I just wanted to show this, just to show perspective. These were very large homes, not too dissimilar from our homes today in terms of size. This model demonstrates what a village might have looked like. We've got several longhouses protected by a defensive wall. More than one family would have lived inside one of these longhouses. Several families, maybe 5 or 6. The French typically describe them as smoky and dirty. Here we see some additional visuals associated with the interior of a longhouse. While the French described these as dirty and smoky, often what would happen is that different items would be stored near the roofline where that smoke would congregate after it drifted up. This had a purpose. In a way, these served as a refrigerator. They didn't have electricity back then. As the smoke would go up, different vermin would not want to go up there and try to eat different pieces of food or different nibble on different items like skins and things like that. It also helped to preserve the food that they had up there and the different items. The French criticized it, but actually it had a very important function. As the Huron reached their teen years, sexual experimentation was acceptable and even encouraged. Once a young couple were ready to marry, they usually would move to the longhouse of the wife. Now that we've explored the Huron and Wyandots and their general traits and society, let's explore their economy. Contrary to what Hollywood would have us believe, the Wyandots placed a heavy emphasis on farming. Probably over 50% of their food came from agricultural products. Their primary crops were corn, beans, and squash. They also grew sunflowers and tobacco. Women were the primary agriculturalists. However, men tended to be the ones who grew the tobacco. Fields had to be cleared. This was done by girdling trees and using fire. One could begin clearing an area by having a small fire at the base of a tree. By maintaining this and keeping it small, this would weaken the tree and not burn down the entire forest. Once it was weakened, a sledgehammer, like the one held by this gentleman here, was used to knock down the tree. The corn, beans, and squash were actually planted together. The corn took nitrogen from the soil, and beans added it, so this was a symbiotic relationship. During the fall, there often was a harvest festival of sorts, and there was an abundance of food. Women were the primary agriculturalists, while men hunted and fished. Fish were caught in a variety of ways, and they also had to be preserved. We can see a fish trap in the upper right-hand photo. Animals were hunted primarily for furs, tools like from their bones and antlers, and for fresh meat. Bows and arrows were used to hunt deer, but on the left you see how sometimes many deer were scared or driven toward a group of hunters. Hopefully you can see that in the image. Also, spears were used, and a special type of a spear was an atlatl. This allowed someone to throw a spear very long distances at a very high speed. Native Americans did not have horses before European contact, so transportation was on foot or on water. On the left, we see a birch bark canoe. Very, very typical, and probably the most important vehicle. On the right, you can see some snowshoes. That way a person could get around in the winter. The community of Wyandotte is named for the Wyandotte Indians. Here we see a statue in honor of the Wyandottes, which was unveiled in the year 2000. The Wyandottes may have been the largest Indian nation in Michigan, but let's explore some additional groups as well. Now, before I go into specifics, I'd like to talk about the so-called People of the Three Fires. There was a special relationship between the Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe. Initially, these three Indian tribes were probably part of the same nation. After European contact, they split apart. However, a special kinship was continued. Each was part of the Anishinaabe language of speakers, and they also had many common traditions. The first to be addressed would be the Ottawa. At or about 1600, there probably were between 3,000 and 4,000 Ottawa living in the northwestern regions of what is now Michigan's Lower Peninsula. If you look at the map on the left, the arrow is pointing to the general location of many Ottawa villages in West Michigan. On the right, you can see the circled area identifies the Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa, as well as the Little River Band of Ottawa. The Ottawa were similar to the Huron or Wyandot, but different. Their economy was based on hunting and farming. However, they relied much less on farming than the Wyandots did. They were much more reliant on hunting. They lived in lodges which allowed them to be very mobile. Probably the thing that they're most known for was as their specialization. They were traders. In fact, the name Adawe was part of the Anishinaabe language, which means to trade. The Potawatomi are next. In or about 1600, there probably were about 4,000 Potawatomi living in western Michigan. They were in the lower peninsula, and they actually had their origins in Wisconsin, and due to recent conflict with other Native Americans, they were recent arrivals to Michigan. The arrow on the map on the left identifies where the Potawatomi were located maybe a couple hundred years ago. And on the right, we see a circled area as well. The name Potawatomi actually comes from some of their actions because their name means people of the fire. This probably refers to the techniques that they used to clear farmland. Just as the Huron were farmers, so too were the Potawatomi. They burned large stretches of grass and brush with fires, and so that's how they earned their name. And just like the Hurons, they planted corn, beans, and squash. They were hunters and they were farmers. They also were more mobile than the Wyandots. The Ottawa and Potawatomi were smaller in number. However, the Chippewa or Ojibwe were larger. At or about 1600, there probably were about 30,000 Chippewa or Ojibwe. Many were living in Canada, but others were also congregated around what is now Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So this map identifies the location of the Chippewa. Notice the purple area, much of it is located in what's now Canada, but also there were large numbers in and around what's now Sault Ste. Marie. Just a side note, I've decided to spell Ojibwe Ojibwe. There are many different spellings, and you can see some examples of this here. Again, if we go back to that map that I've been showing, we see some Ojibwe in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but also the northern sections of the Lower Peninsula. The Ojibwe were very mobile. During the summer months, they would live in villages, but for the rest of the year, they practiced tremendous mobility, and their homes reflected this. Here we see an example of a Chippewa bark lodge or a summer home. It would be difficult to move or transport this. The Chippewa lived in wigwams. We see a couple of examples here. And sometimes they look like teepees, but teepees were homes that were made of animal skin. Instead of animal skin, these wigwams were made of grass, maybe bark, or woven mats. We see an example of one in a dome shape on the left. And on the right, this is more of a triangle. Kind of looks like a teepee, but because it's made of basswood bark, this is a wigwam as opposed to a teepee. The Ojibwe engaged in some farming, but they also were hunters. But one thing that they were most famous for was their ability to catch fish in very dangerous waters. The arrow here points to a region near what's now Sault Ste. Marie. This was very famous for a lot of the rapids, and a lot of fish would come into this area, and it was really difficult and dangerous to try to catch these fish. Well, the Ojibwe were famous at being able to get as many fish as possible in this area. Today, we don't have the rapids at Sault Ste. Marie because we've got the locks. However, the Ojibwe were really important, and they had earned this reputation as great fishermen in this area of what is now Sault Ste. Marie. Well, we're just about done. I'd like to finish with some concluding ideas. Today I tried to talk about Native Americans in Michigan. First, I tried to explore the origins of Native Americans in all of North America, and therefore Michigan. What we see is tremendous diversity among different Native American groups. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to write an essay that would compare and contrast some of the similar as well as the different traits or characteristics of these Indian nations. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care, and I'll see you in class.